Thank you so much, Deborah. And I'm going to pick up right at the points that you've raised specifically about context and about access. So let me bring up my slides. And I just want to begin by thanking the Planning Committee and the National Academies for inviting me to participate in this really exciting program. So I'm going to do four things very quickly in this presentation. I'm going to talk about networks, in particular practice-based research networks, as a way of framing the discussion around context. I'm going to examine barriers to including older adults in clinical research, particularly around areas of study design, study access, and participation. I'm going to highlight some issues from 3 ongoing studies at Clinical Directors Network to see how they illustrate strategies to enhance the participation of older adults, and then close with some recommendations and conclusions. So just to set the background, primary care or practice-based research networks, PBRNs, are groups of ambulatory care practices that have that are joined by a network structure that transcends any single research project, and it links practicing clinicians with experienced clinical investigators, and more recently, patients are part of that mix as well. And it's committed to enhancing the research skills of the network clinician members, and really is the framework for creating a learning healthcare system. But it's important to remember that the clinicians who are practicing in these settings are really committed to the delivery of healthcare services, and research is then a secondary question. So the challenge for practice-based research networks is how to align the service delivery mission with the research mission. So I'll examine Clinical Directors Network as a case study, and Clinical Directors Network has built this scalable infrastructure that can be used and reused for conducting real-world studies in practices where patients receive care. And in particular, I'll talk about the members of our network and our network of networks, which is a network of practice-based research networks through our AHRQ Center of Excellence. But the primary care sites that we work most closely with are the HRSA-funded Federally Qualified Health Centers, or FQHCs. And for this particular conversation, FQHCs provide a really, really important opportunity. There are nearly 13,000 delivery sites, 1,300 grantees with 13,000 delivery sites across the United States. And if we look at the age distribution of patients who receive their care in FQHCs, about 1 in 5 patients are over the age of 55. So there's a substantial number, upwards of 6 million. These are low-income, minority, medically underserved, many are not U.S. born, who receive their care and who have systematically been excluded from research. So it serves, I think, our purposes to examine how we can engage these populations in clinical and translational research. So I want to focus on really 2 aspects of study design considerations and access barriers to really try to understand the challenges that we need to overcome to engage older adults in research. And I want to begin by picking up on the access question. And if we think back to Deborah's slides, in the research translation realm, once we've demonstrated efficacy and effectiveness, the next phase is really implementation. And therein lies the question of access. And so many of the studies that we conduct are actually hybrid studies that combine questions of clinical effectiveness, what works best for which populations, and implementation science questions. How do we get these products, these services to the populations, to the individuals who will most likely benefit? So what are the improved processes that we can develop so that research has to not only consider its effectiveness, but the strategies to implement, which means, again, going back to understanding the barriers. And when we conduct these research studies in real-world settings, the more pragmatic we can make these trials, the more we can follow principles of pragmatic design that understand the context variables and understand how context affects delivery are going to be very, very key to not only demonstrating clinical effectiveness and comparative effectiveness, but also demonstrating implementation, access, and improved population health outcomes. So some of the key access barriers that I think have come to light in the COVID period of time as both a challenge and an opportunity are use of mHealth, eHealth, and telehealth technologies. In the period of time when sites closed down and were only providing care to those who were presenting with COVID-like illnesses and COVID, the question was, how can we continue to provide access through telehealth? And I think we'll look back at this period of time as the most rapid adoption of technology in history, and it'll be an important opportunity from this natural experiment to learn what were the enabling factors that allowed this rapid uptake on the health system side and on the patient side. Nevertheless, there are still these barriers, and if we look at the recurrent data from Pew on internet access and mobile telephone use, most seniors do say that they need help in using these devices. So while telehealth strategies are going to be very critical both in the present and in the future for improving access to clinical trials and access to care, there are going to be other enabling services that are going to need to be built around improving that access to telehealth. So let me turn now to briefly examine some aspects of these 3 case studies from Clinical Directors Network. We are a primary care practice-based research network, a clinical training, clinician training organization, and a network of networks. First studies that I want to look at use mHealth and eHealth strategies to improve hypertension control, diabetes control. I'll then examine a cluster randomized trial that's looking exactly at this population of patients with multiple chronic conditions. And then finally, briefly touch on an implementation study also designed to improve blood pressure and hypertension control in low-income older adults. So the first set of studies I want to look at are mHealth-based, which are studies that we have been using text messaging, interactive text messaging, both in terms of bringing hypertension control messages and diabetes self-management messages to low health literacy, low income populations. In these studies, we've relied heavily on using the electronic health records to identify eligible patients, to help us outreach to those patients, and then to capture both baseline and clinical outcome results data from these studies. At the same time, we've combined that information with self-reported, patient-reported measures and measures obtained from laboratory tests and measures obtained from self-monitoring devices such as home blood pressure monitors and home blood glucose monitors. And so that framework of mHealth and eHealth takes many of the clinical services that normally would have required a trip to a doctor's office and puts them back in the household, back under the control of the patient and their caregiver, and arguably creates higher levels of health literacy and self-efficacy, which may improve self-management and clinical outcome. Second strategy that I want to briefly examine asks the question, what is the effect of adding a health coach to patients who receive their primary care in federally qualified health centers that are patient-centered medical homes? And these specifically are patients with multiple chronic conditions. And so for this clinical trial, it's a cluster randomized trial. We recruited 4 health systems, 2 in New York City, 2 in Chicago, and then 4 of the health centers that are embedded within each of these health systems, which serve primarily low-income African-American and Latino patients with multiple chronic conditions. So to get into this trial, we extracted electronic health records data from the practices. We looked for patients with a Charlson Comorbidity Index score of 4 or greater, and we are currently recruiting 1,920 patients across these sites. And recruitment, while it had slowed down when we went to completely remote recruitment, using the telephone and using outreach and introductions that came from the sites, where the clinicians at the sites introduced their patients to us, to the research staff, and then we were able to carry on with the informed consent visit, the baseline visit, and the intervention delivery. So what's critical about this study is that it was designed to focus exactly on this population of patients with high medical comorbidity, which mean they're largely older. But the other key aspect of this is really the structure of all of the networks that we brought together. So we brought together two of the PCORnet-funded clinical data research networks, Capricorn and Insight, in Chicago and New York, as well as the Health Information Exchange in New York City, and then the 16 health centers, two practice-based research networks, CDN and Alliance Chicago. And what's critical about that is that the research networks have a strong relationship with the federally qualified health centers, the clinicians, and the staff through that long-term relationship of training and research development. And with that relationship, we've established trust with the practices. The patients trust the practices. So we are able to leverage that trust by proxy and build on those relationships, and then enhance our ability to capture information that's collected routinely as part of care. We enhance that information with some additional patient-reported measures that are captured by telephone and sometimes by internet for those participants who are able to. And then we combine that into a large research analytic data set that captures electronic health records data, hospital event data, emergency department utilization data, and patient-reported outcomes, in addition to the clinical information from the electronic health record. Finally, the last
we got one more minute.
Okay, thank you. The last project that I want to mention is an implementation study in a series of senior centers in East Harlem and in New York City that asks the question, since the seniors, the older adults, receive most of their meals, breakfast and lunch, at these sites, if we were to adapt the meals that are provided to make them compatible with the dietary approaches to stop hypertension, is that an effective strategy to implement the DASH diet for low-income seniors? And as a result of that, will we lower their systolic blood pressure and improve blood pressure control? So in terms of context, the centers that I'm mentioning, these senior centers, provide meals to over 250,000 adults in congregate settings usually, so they provide meals, educational activities, and social support. But in this instance, the meals have been transitioned to home delivery or grab and go for COVID-related safety issues. But this, again, is another infrastructure in place, not only in New York City, but nationally, that really do provide access to older adults and opportunities to engage in clinical research. And by combining practice-based research networks, the community-engaged research core of the CTSA at Rockefeller, and a network of social services providers funded by the New York City Department for the Aging, we've been able to bring together and conduct this implementation trial, which is another kind of network, but a very important opportunity to integrate the care, the delivery, and the data across multiple service providers. So in summary, the recommendations that I would propose are to increase the use of telehealth and home visits, to try to provide more telephone navigation, and to provide barrier-reducing health education strategies. Practice-based research networks provide opportunities to engage clinicians and patients with broader eligibility criteria. They can engage both clinical and social services staff. They provide real-world care in real-world settings. When incorporated into studies using pragmatic and hybrid effectiveness and implementation, designs can test both the intervention effectiveness and the setting effects. And so it's critical to think about how to partner with these kinds of practices, because they not only help us understand the clinical effectiveness, but also the clinical implementation. We need to develop heterogeneous populations that are large enough in number to provide adequate statistically powered sample sizes, and to allow us to examine that heterogeneity. And I thank you for the opportunity to share this information this morning.